I watched my sons celebrate my death while I was still breathing. They thought I couldn't hear them from the hospital bed, but the morphine hadn't kicked in yet. Michael was already dividing up my assets. James was planning which house to sell first. 2 weeks after the hospital, they dragged me into my lawyer's office. They'd forgotten one thing. I used to be a retired financial auditor. I knew exactly how to give them what they wanted. Before we continue, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop your city and the time in the comments. The family meeting was supposed to be about my will. Instead, it became about my worth. I could feel people watching from the lawyer's office, not helping. Just watching as my own children discussed my money like I wasn't even there. Some of you know exactly what this feels like. Michael sat across from me, his expression cold and calculating. James leaned back in his chair with barely concealed impatience. Daughter-in-law Beth kept checking her phone, already mentally spending money that wasn't theirs yet. Dad, we need to be realistic about your future, Michael said. His tone was measured, professional, the same voice he'd used as a bank manager before they fired him for performance issues. You're 72. Living alone in that big house isn't safe anymore. The big house, our family home for 40 years, where I'd raised them both after their mother died, where every room held memories they wanted to liquidate. My collapse in the hospital 2 weeks earlier was the first sign of what they'd been waiting for. 2 weeks later, they tried to turn one hospital slip into a legal weapon. We've looked at some nice assisted living facilities, James added. He had his laptop open, showing me glossy brochures of places that looked like hotels but smelled like disinfectant and resignation. The good news is, selling the house will cover the costs for several years, maybe longer if we're smart about investments. They weren't asking for my opinion. They were informing me of their decision. William, my attorney, sat quietly taking notes. I'd known him for 20 years. He understood what was happening better than my sons realized. What about Paul's wishes? William asked mildly. Michael laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of dismissive sound successful people make when discussing obstacles they've already decided to remove. Dad's wishes got him into this situation. Living alone, forgetting to eat, that incident last month where he got confused at the grocery store. The incident. I'd asked a clerk where to find coffee filters and couldn't remember the brand name immediately. Suddenly, that became evidence of cognitive decline. We're trying to help him, Beth said, finally looking up from her phone, before something serious happens. But they weren't looking at me with concern. They were looking at me like a problem that needed solving, like an asset that needed managing. If you've ever been listening to a story like this alone at night, you already understand. The humiliation wasn't the assumption that I couldn't take care of myself. It was the realization that my sons had been planning this conversation for months, maybe years. They'd forgotten who raised them. They'd forgotten what I used to do for a living. What they wanted was my signature on documents that would transfer everything I owned into a trust they controlled. What I gave them was exactly that. I didn't argue at that family meeting. I listened. I observed. I remembered every word. Over the next week, I started paying attention to things I had dismissed before. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Hushed conversations between Michael and James that stopped when they noticed me. That week, I slept with my bedroom door locked for the first time in my own house. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe grief over losing my independence was making me paranoid about my own children. For a moment, watching James help me with grocery shopping that weekend, I almost convinced myself I was wrong. He seemed genuinely caring, asking about my medications, making sure I had everything I needed. Then I caught him taking photos of my mail when he thought I wasn't looking. The doubt crept back in. That night, I realized the problem wasn't my memory. The problem was trust. It was past midnight when that thought settled in. The house was silent, and I was wide awake. They'd been building a case against my competency for months, training me to depend on them, collecting evidence of confusion. Michael had moved back into the guest room temporarily after his divorce. Just until I got back on my feet, he'd said. That was 8 months ago. He'd been documenting everything. James visited daily now, bringing groceries and picking up prescriptions. Helpful, attentive, recording everything on his phone. Neither had jobs anymore. Both lived off my generosity while building a case that I was too incompetent to manage it. But I needed proof beyond my suspicions. That's when I called Carl, the private investigator William recommended. Your sons are creating documentation, Carl said during our first meeting. Medical appointments where they speak for you. Financial meetings where they guide your decisions. They're establishing a pattern. The thought made my stomach turn. My own sons manipulating my life to steal my assets. But I'd raised them. I'd taught them about planning, about patience. Do it, I said. What the investigation revealed would guide everything that came next. That night, I realized something worse than betrayal was coming. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were preparing to erase me entirely. I didn't react. I remembered everything. I remembered the surveillance devices were installed while both sons were out. Professional audio recording equipment disguised as everyday objects throughout the common areas. For 5 days, nothing remarkable. Normal conversation, television, the sounds of a house where 3 adults lived in careful politeness. Then, on the 6th evening, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Michael's voice. "The financial advisor meeting is next Tuesday. You know what to say." That was it. Just one cryptic sentence before they moved to the kitchen, out of range. What financial advisor meeting? I hadn't scheduled anything. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the headphones, hoping for more, but they'd gone silent. The next evening, I caught fragments of another conversation. James. "How long before we can start liquidating the larger assets?" Michael. "Once the trust is active and we have medical documentation. 6 months, maybe less if we get the right doctor's assessment." I stood up from my chair, pacing, my heart hammering. Then, Beth called them for dinner. The conversation ended. Liquidating assets? What trust? I pulled off the headphones, wiped the sweat from my palms, then put them back on. On the 3rd night, I heard the conversation that would end our family forever. Michael's voice was clear now. "The beauty of this approach is Dad thinks it's his idea. We suggest the trust for his protection. He signs willingly, and we control everything." James responded, "Once he's declared incompetent, we can sell the house and move him wherever we want. The inheritance becomes available immediately instead of waiting for him to die." I was in my study, headphones on, recording their conspiracy about how to legally steal everything I'd worked 70 years to build. Then Sarah, Beth's sister, jumped in. "What if he resists the medical evaluation?" Michael replied, "He won't. We've been conditioning him for months, making him doubt his own memory, his own judgment. By now, he probably believes he needs help." Michael laughed then. "Not nervous, confident, too confident. That's when I knew they'd underestimate me. They'd calculated my worth down to the penny. While planning my legal erasure, these men had forgotten that I'd spent 40 years as a financial auditor. I knew every trick they were attempting because I'd investigated people who'd used the exact same methods. "What if someone challenges the trust?" James asked. "Who's going to challenge it?" Michael said confidently. "Dad's isolated. We're his only family. The lawyer we're using specializes in exactly these situations." The lawyer they were using, not William, my attorney, someone they'd hired without my knowledge. I removed the headphones, sat in my study while my sons discussed my future like I was already dead. The next morning, I called William with a simple instruction. "Prepare documents for a comprehensive estate restructuring. I want to give my sons exactly what they want." But I had no idea what I was walking into. At the time, it felt harmless. 2 weeks later, I would watch my sons discover exactly what I'd given them. But back then, I still thought legal documents would be enough. I thought giving them what they wanted would end everything. By the way, are you listening with headphones right now or on a speaker? Tell me in the comments. I was wrong. It was only the moment they realized I'd been listening all along. "I have everything I need," I told William over the phone. "Audio recordings, financial evidence, documented plans. I want to create something that looks exactly like what they're expecting, but protects everything I actually value." William was quiet for a moment. "Paul, you understand what this means. Your relationship with your sons will be permanently damaged." "They damaged it themselves. I'm just acknowledging reality. This type of estate restructuring will require careful legal construction. Are you prepared for the psychological pressure they'll apply once documents are signed?" "I'm prepared." William said the trust restructuring would lock everything down exactly as they wanted, and the revelation would come when it mattered most. Do it. All of it. The trust documents arrived by courier 1 week later. I spent an evening reviewing every page, complex legal language that appeared to give my sons control over my assets and medical decisions upon my incapacitation. But buried in the subsections were provisions they'd never bothered to read carefully. provisions that would activate under very specific circumstances. Everything went exactly as they expected. Upon my death or legal incapacitation, everything would transfer to them. They'd get exactly what they wanted. My signature didn't shake when I signed those papers. It shook when I realized how long they'd been planning this betrayal. The documents were filed with the court, copies sent to relevant financial institutions, legal structure in place exactly as my sons had planned. That single conversation changed everything. The family celebration happened 3 days after the trust was signed. Michael had made dinner reservations at the most expensive restaurant in town. To thank Dad for being so reasonable about his future, he told the hostess. They thought they'd won. During appetizers, James raised his glass. To Dad for trusting us to take care of everything. Michael added, you won't have to worry about finances or medical decisions anymore. We've got everything handled. They toasted my surrender. That's when I made my announcement. Boys, there's something you should know about the trust you were so eager for me to sign. Their smiles flickered. I've been recording your conversations for 3 months. The color drained from Michael's face. The trust you think gives you complete control? Read Section 7, subsection C very carefully. James fumbled for his phone, probably trying to access the documents electronically. It states that if the beneficiaries have demonstrated intent to defraud or manipulate the grantor, all assets transfer to designated charities. William insisted we add a fraud trigger clause, standard for high-value estates. Michael's voice cracked. Dad, what are you talking about? You. The recordings, Michael. Every single conversation about liquidating my assets, moving me to facilities, declaring me incompetent, all carefully documented and legally admissible. Beth's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the restaurant floor. Section 12 explains the evidence requirements for such a determination. Audio recordings qualify as sufficient proof. The waitress approached our table, concerned about the broken glass and the sudden tension. We'll need a few minutes, I told her calmly. James leaned across the table. You can't do this. We're your sons. You stopped being my sons when you started planning to erase me. That single conversation changed everything. The next 6 weeks were psychological warfare. They tried love, then fear, then law. First came emotional manipulation. Michael showed up at my door with flowers, tears in his eyes. Dad, we love you. This is all a misunderstanding. Then came medical pressure. James arrived with a doctor's appointment card. You're not thinking clearly. Finally came legal intimidation. Their attorney sent William a formal letter. Each week I waited for them to apologize. They never did. Instead, they hired their own attorney and began building a case that I was mentally incompetent when I signed the trust, making it invalid. They'd forgotten that I'd anticipated this move. Carl's investigation had uncovered their backup plan. If the trust strategy failed, they intended to have me declared mentally unfit and assume guardianship over my person and estate. The irony was perfect. The same evidence they'd spent months collecting to prove my incompetency would be used against them in court. But they had one more card to play that I hadn't expected. Quiet people always prepare louder than they speak. 6 months after the restaurant confrontation, Michael and James filed a lawsuit challenging the trust. They claimed I'd been manipulated into signing documents I didn't understand due to cognitive decline. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning downtown. I arrived early with William. Michael and James sat across with their attorney, an expensive-looking woman who specialized in elder law disputes. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were using elder law, designed to protect people like me, to steal from me. But something else was happening that I hadn't anticipated. Michael looked terrible, gaunt, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in months. James fidgeted constantly. During a brief recess, I overheard their attorney speaking to them in the hallway. Your father's recordings are legally admissible. Unless you have evidence of severe cognitive impairment, this case is unwinnable. Michael's voice was desperate. What about the medical documentation? Minor memory lapses. Nothing that would invalidate a legal signature. James erupted. So we wasted 2 years for nothing? Their attorney looked uncomfortable. The recordings suggest premeditation. Continuing could result in criminal fraud charges. That's when I understood the real cost of their greed. Sometimes I watch them at the grocery store now. They see me, look away quickly, then hurry toward different aisles. A man at the coffee shop whispered, "That's him." Not with pity, with warning. People in small towns remember when adult children try to steal from their parents. It was almost 2 a.m. when I sat there alone, listening to their voices again. The night before the final court hearing, I sat in my study where I'd first heard their voices. I pulled out a photo of my late wife, Margaret. She'd died 5 years earlier. I wondered what she'd think of what I'd done. Would she approve? Then I remembered her final words. "Don't let anyone take advantage of your kindness, Paul." She'd known exactly what they were capable of. She'd died trying to protect me from this exact scenario. I sleep well, knowing I chose legal protection over family loyalty, Margaret's wisdom over my son's manipulation. But late at night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes wonder if there was another way. Silence has a way of asking questions no one else dares to ask. The price of being right was higher than expected. Justice came with loneliness. But when I read those scholarship fund letters, when I remember Margaret's warning, I know I made the right choice. The final hearing lasted 3 hours. Michael and James presented their case first. Cognitive decline, undue influence, legal manipulation by unscrupulous advisors. Their attorney was professional, thorough, and ultimately futile. William played the recordings. Michael's voice filled the courtroom. Once he's declared incompetent, we can sell the house and move him wherever we want. James's voice followed. The inheritance becomes available immediately instead of waiting for him to die. The judge listened to 20 minutes of audio documentation. Their conspiracy, their planning, their casual discussion of my life like I was already dead. When the recordings ended, William stood and read one sentence from the trust. Section 7, subsection C. Upon evidence of beneficiary fraud, all assets transferred to designated charitable organizations. Michael's lawyer stopped writing. James's face went gray. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked at Michael and James with an expression I'd never seen directed at my children before. Disgust. Complete, undisguised disgust. "Gentlemen," the judge said, "in 30 years on this bench, I've never heard such clear evidence of elder exploitation planning." Michael tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, your father," the judge said sharply, "demonstrated remarkable foresight in protecting himself from your predatory behavior." The ruling took 10 minutes to read aloud. Trust upheld, assets fully protected, criminal investigation recommended for attempted elder fraud. As they were led away to provide statements to investigators, Michael looked back at me one final time. "You forgot who raised you," I said quietly. "You forgot what I used to do for a living." 3 years have passed since that dramatic courtroom confrontation. Michael works retail now at a discount store downtown. James delivers food for a rideshare company across town. Both live in small, cramped apartments they can barely afford each month. They never went to prison. The investigation said the intent was absolutely obvious, but they'd failed before they could successfully take anything. But they lost something far more valuable than their freedom itself. They lost their reputations in our small community, their relationships, and any hope of inheritance. Margaret spent her final dying weeks discovering our sons were planning to exploit my grief. She suffered through that knowledge alone. Her final act was warning me. Her letter protected what we'd built together. If I'd ignored that warning, enabled their plans out of misguided loyalty, I would have dishonored her sacrifice. Would you have protected yourself? Or forgiven them simply because they were your children? Justice doesn't ever shout. It waits. Some of us are much older, but we're definitely not blind anymore. If you've ever been betrayed by close family, you're certainly not alone. Tell me in the comments, if you were in my place, would you have done the same? Before you go, where are you watching from? City or country? What time is it there? Let's see how far this very story traveled.